Thank you so much, and thank you, Steve. I just am in awe of the amount of work that Steve does to put on this event, which is just absolutely phenomenal. I'm so honored to be here. I now live in Calgary, Alberta, which is the western part of Canada. And I have to say I need to update my little bio for Steve, because I've written 2 books since that time, Kick Diabetes Essentials and the Kick Diabetes Cookbook. And I'm actually working on a 12th with a pediatrician right now called Nourish, and it'll be out probably in the fall. Today what I'm going to be talking about is getting it right, meeting nutritional needs on a plant-based diet. And I'll just provide a brief outline. We'll actually touch on 3 specific questions. The first, are plant-based diets, especially vegetarian and vegan diets, actually safe and adequate? Number 2, how can we ensure sufficient nutrients? So we'll look at protein, iron, B12, omega-3 fatty acids, calcium, and iodine. And the final question is we'll address, are there benefits beyond ourselves to eating plant-based? So the first question, are plant-based diets safe and adequate? This man that you see here, his name is Dr. Mervyn Harding, and he was one of the original pioneers of vegetarian nutrition research. And I was at a conference, it must have been in the 1990s when he said this, and I thought it was quite profound. Attitudes towards vegetarian diets have progressed from ridicule and skepticism to condescending tolerance, to gradual and sometimes grudging acceptance, and finally, to acclaim. I can remember 40 years ago, when I was in university, we learned 2 things about vegetarian and vegan diets. Number 1, we learned that vegetarian diets are risky and not appropriate for those under 20 years of age or for pregnant and lactating women. And number 2, we learned that vegan diets are downright dangerous for everyone. That was 40 years ago. Attitudes started to change in the 80s. People became skeptical, like Dr. Harding said. They thought, well, it may be okay to be vegetarian if you're super careful, but be ultra cautious with vegan diets. And at the time I was working in Canada as a public health nutritionist, the 4 food groups, just like the basic 4 in the States, were the foundation of nutrition education programs. And I can tell you, thankfully, things have changed. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics position statement in 2016 is the following. Appropriately planned vegetarian, including vegan diets, are healthful, nutritionally adequate, and may provide health benefits in the prevention and treatment of certain diseases. Now listen to this. These diets are appropriate for all stages of the life cycle, including pregnancy, lactation, infancy, childhood, adolescence, older adulthood, and for athletes. And this is the #1 evidence-based resource in the world. This is used by physicians and dietitians and hospitals all over the planet. So this you can rely on. And I showed you Canada's food guide from several years ago in a previous slide. Well, this is Canada's food guide today. We have come a long way. You can see half the plate, fruit and vegetables. A quarter of the plate is whole grains, and the other quarter is protein-rich foods. And they've got a little bit of dairy and a little bit of animal products, but they also, these are all just options. They also have lots of legumes and tofu and nuts and seeds and so forth. There is not a distinct dairy group anymore. It's not considered one of the essential 4. And this was a long time in the making, and I'm very proud of Canada for taking the turn that they did. But what you notice is things are changing. And so I want to take a look at the evidence at a glance, particularly for the people in the most vulnerable years. So let's talk about pregnancy. Well, vegetarian, including vegan pregnancy outcomes such as birth weight and pregnancy duration are similar to non-vegetarian pregnancy outcomes. And the differences reported are the following. There's a lower risk of excessive weight gain in the vegetarians, and the rates of pregnancy complications are generally lower among vegetarians. The largest vegan study to date was done a long time ago. It was done on the farm in 1987 and included 775 vegan women. The vegan diets did not affect the birth weights of the children. But preeclampsia was 0.1% among the vegetarian women compared to 5 to 10% in the general population. And the authors of this study concluded that it is possible to sustain a normal pregnancy on a vegan diet, and that a vegan diet could alleviate most, if not all, signs and symptoms of preeclampsia. So what about infant and child outcomes? Well, we know for Lacto-Ovo vegetarians that there have been studies, multiple studies over decades that have proven that Lacto-Ovo vegetarians are safe and adequate. Lacto-Ovo vegetarian diets are safe and adequate for infants and children. Well, what about vegan diets? Well, there are far fewer cohorts, and mostly we have dated studies. We have consistently positive results on children being fed well-planned vegan diets. We have also seen negative results on children fed very restrictive vegan diets, and especially when parents are using homemade formulas instead of breastfeeding. And there were a number of studies back in the 70s and 80s of very grossly malnourished children who were being fed a formula that contained about 17 calories per 100 mils compared to about 70 if they were having breast milk. So these children were essentially starving to death. So that's not a good plan. Every time we see a child who's malnourished because they're consuming a plant-based diet, it sets us back 20 or 30 years. It's really important that we get it right, and it's not that difficult either. So let's talk about the vegan studies. There are really two classic studies. One that, they basically reported that well-designed vegan diets support normal growth and development. The first was by Saunders in 1988. This one was out of the UK, and they followed 39 vegan children into adulthood. And although they were slightly smaller and lighter than omnivores, they were very healthy. And then the bigger one was O'Connell in the United States. This is the farm study again. 404 vegan children. They had slightly slower growth between 1 and 3 years, and that was because they were being breastfed and not being fed formula. But there were no differences after the age of 5, and those children did very well. The take-home message here is well-planned plant-based diets are safe and adequate at every stage of the life cycle. But infancy and childhood are stages of life where adequate growth and development are really the #1 nutritional priorities. The diets for children must be designed to meet the unique needs of infants and children. They need to be a little higher in fat than they do for adults, for example. In the position paper, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics outlines the advantages of well-designed plant-based diets for children. And what we see in children being raised on plant-based diets is greater consumption of vegetables and fruits, fewer sweets and salty snacks, lower intake of fat, especially saturated fat, reduced risk of overweight and obesity, and the establishment of lifelong healthy eating habits. And so there are many advantages for children. So what about adults? Do adults eating mostly or entirely plant-based meet nutritional needs? Well, there have been multiple studies looking at this, but the two biggest are Epic Oxford in 2016 and the Adventist Health Study in 2013. And I just want to show you the results because they're actually really quite surprising for people. So in Epic Oxford, they examined over 30,000 individuals, and they were all health-conscious people, but with different dietary patterns. So some were meat eaters, some were vegetarian or vegan. And the meat eaters had the highest intakes of protein, vitamin B2, which is riboflavin, B12, D, zinc, and iodine. And the vegans had the highest intakes of fiber, vitamin C and E, folate, magnesium, iron, copper, and polyunsaturated fatty acids. What about suboptimal intakes? Well, the meat eaters, about 50% were low in vitamin E, and the meat eaters also had the highest calorie intakes, the highest intakes of total and saturated fat, and the lowest intakes of fiber, all of which, of course, are not good. Now, vegetarian and vegans tended to have low B12 levels. About 17% of Lacto-Ovo vegetarians were low, and vegans, probably 85 to 90% were low in this study. And iodine, again, the vegans, over 90% were low in iodine. So that's something to consider. The conclusion of these researchers was that compliance with dietary goals was high, and the prevalence of inadequate nutrition was low among all the dietary groups. The vegan diets appeared most protective against cardiometabolic diseases, and the vegans, however, do need to use fortified foods or supplements to ensure sufficient B12 and iodine. So are there any health benefits? And the answer is absolutely. Vegetarians and vegans are at reduced risk of ischemic heart disease, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, certain types of cancer, and obesity. And if you look at the numbers, and we won't go through this in any detail, but the red bars are the omnivores, and these are health-conscious omnivores. So these are people that exercise the same amount, smoke the same amount, drink the same amount of alcohol as the vegetarians and vegans, and they're conscious about their diets as well. But look at this. If you look at the Lacto-Ovo vegetarians in blue here, these numbers are the risk, the reduction that we see in various diseases. So when you see 0.45 for hypertension, it means that they have 55% less hypertension than the omnivores, okay? So these are risk ratios. You can see for vegans, it's even better. So for hypertension, 75% lower because it's 0.25. And you can see for cardiovascular disease and kidney disease, the vegans and vegetarians are combined, but more than 50% of a risk reduction for kidney disease and about 32% risk reduction for cardiovascular disease. And you can also see not quite as stellar results for cancer and mortality, but still significant. Mortality was 15% lower among vegans and about 9% lower among Lacto-Ovo vegetarians in the Adventist Health Study too. Calcium, many people ask, isn't calcium or isn't cow's milk necessary for strong bones? I can remember when my son was in grade 2, some kids at school were saying, well, if you don't drink milk, you're just going to be a pile of blood and skin on the floor. You're not going to have any bones. He came home, Mommy. So there's this very strong prejudice in our society that milk, cow's milk, is necessary for strong human bones. And I would say it is no more necessary than moose milk. Cow's milk has a lot of calcium. It's got about 300 milligrams per cup. But moose milk actually has 600 milligrams per cup. And we don't call it an essential food. If you look at pre-agricultural human history, humans averaged 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams of calcium per day without a single drop of cow's milk. And in my opinion, it really defies rationality to assume that that any species would require the milk of another species for its survival. You know, each species designs its milk uniquely to help their offspring achieve the growth they need to achieve. You know, a 65-pound calf or whatever, we're blowing up into however many 300 or 400-pound cow in a fairly short order, and that, you know, that milk is uniquely designed to achieve that task. Human milk is designed for human infants, and to me it just is you know, it doesn't make logical sense that any species would need the milk of another species. And calcium-rich, we can get our calcium from plants. And calcium-rich plant foods offer some pretty impressive advantages over dairy. So they're generally low in total fat, they're low in saturated fat, and they're rich sources of vitamin C and K and folate. They're rich sources of magnesium, potassium, and boron. They're rich in antioxidants and phytochemicals. And so all of these things, to me, make plants a preferable choice. If we look at our recommendations for calcium are quite variable around the world. So they're lower in the UK. I think it's about 700 milligrams there versus 1,000 to 1,200 in North America. And so it's 1,000 for most adults, and for females 51 to 70, and males over 70, it's 1,200. So if we look at calcium intakes, and so again the red is the non-veg, the blue is the Lacto-Ovo, and the green is the vegans, you can see the Lacto-Ovo vegetarians are well above that 1,000 milligrams a day in both the Adventist Health Study 2 and Epic Oxford. The omnivores are pretty close to that 1,000 as well in Adventist Health Study 2 and Epic Oxford. But in the Taiwanese Buddhist Health Study, they're actually only at 542. Then if you look at the vegans, well, in the Adventist Health Study 2, they're very close to the 1,000, but in Epic Oxford, it's only 582. And in the Buddhist Taiwanese study, it's 644. So it's actually higher than the omnivores in the Buddhist Health Study. Why would you think that would be? Well, of course, in Asia, dairy is not a staple. And so intakes would be lower, but they would be higher in the vegetarians because they're probably eating more tofu and more dark green leafy vegetables and things that are relatively high in calcium. If we look at the studies on vegans and bone health, we have about 15 studies that have assessed mineral density in vegans, and 8 actually reported lower, about 10 to 20% lower total bone mineral density among vegans, and 7 found little difference in the bone health of vegans compared to other dietary groups. So about half and half, saying, you know, they have worse or there's little difference. And if we look at fracture rates or fracture risk, we have 3 studies, one showing increased risk rates, one showing increased fracture risk, and one finding no difference. So this is a little concerning for people who are eating entirely plant-based diets. But here's what's interesting. This is the Epic Oxford study, and you can see over here, I don't have a laser pointer, but the 1.3 means 30% more fractures. So this is fracture rates in vegans compared to meat eaters. However, when they looked only at the vegans eating at least 525 milligrams of calcium a day, look at this. There was absolutely no difference between the meat eaters, the fish eaters, the Lacto-Ovo vegetarians, and the vegans. No significant difference whatsoever. But 45% of the vegans had intakes under 525 milligrams, and 76% of the vegans had intakes under 700 milligrams. And so basically the take-home message here is that bone health of vegans can be compromised when calcium intake is very low. Vegans need to consume, it seems like they need to consume at least 525 milligrams of calcium per day, and probably, preferably, should try to meet the RDA for calcium. And this is my personal show-off picture, but anyway, this is me. And this is my personal experience. So I'm 61 years old. I have a very strong family history of osteoporosis. My mom had osteoporosis in her 50s. And I've been a vegan for about 31 years. I had a bone mineral density done. I haven't had one for about 10 years, but I had one after about 20 years being vegan when I was in my 50s, because that's about when my mom got osteoporosis. And my bone mineral density was 2 to 2.5 standard deviations above expected for my age. My doctor said, he showed me my chart. My bone density was too high to plot on the graph. There was an arrow at the top of the chart, and he said, I'm absolutely shocked. He said, I don't know what you're doing, but whatever you're doing, keep doing it. And I can tell you what I'm doing. I make sure I get enough vitamin D. I make sure I get enough calcium. I make sure I get enough boron and magnesium and potassium. I make sure my diet is well planned, but I also exercise, because exercise is a message to your bones to stay strong. And so that's really, really important. I love this cartoon. It's this guy here is saying to this guy who works for the government, good, and now the dairy. He's removing meat from the food groups, and he's asking him politely to remove the dairy. And I thought, isn't this funny? Because that's exactly what the Canadian government just did. I wonder if he was behind it. So there are lots of reasons to get calcium from non-dairy sources. Lactose intolerance. 70% of the world's population is lactose intolerant. Milk is one of our richest sources of saturated fat, which has been strongly linked to cardiovascular risk. It increases risk of prostate cancer, of ovarian cancer. It increases risk of acne. There are a lot of people that are allergic or sensitive to it. It often contains hormones and pesticides. It has been associated with increased risk of type 1 diabetes. And then, of course, there are all the concerns about what we do to cows to get their milk. And this is everybody knows the story in this room, I'm sure. But it is not a very pretty story. And then, of course, there are huge environmental concerns as well with, the number of cows to produce this milk for the human species. But we do need to make sure we include sufficient calcium-rich plant foods in our diet. So the low oxalate leafy greens like kale and broccoli and turnip greens, things like almonds and chia seeds and sesame seeds, figs and tofu that's made with calcium and the blackstrap molasses. And we can include, a lot of legumes are fairly rich sources, and the non-dairy milks that are fortified with calcium are also very rich sources. So, 300 milligrams in a cup often can get people to where they're aiming to be. In some of the books I've written, like Becoming Vegan, Comprehensive and Express Editions, we developed a food guide that I think was pretty much foolproof. So if you follow the guide, you get what you need. And in the middle of the guide, you can see we actually illustrate the calcium-rich foods within each food group. And so that's helpful for people too. And then there are things you can do to make sure you're getting sort of the bone builders in your diet. It's not just about calcium, it's about potassium, magnesium, boron, and zinc. The richest source of boron in the diet is flax seeds. The key vitamins, vitamin B12, C, D, K, and folate. And vitamin K, a lot of people say you need K2 for your bones. You do, but K1 from kale is converted to K2 in your intestinal tract if you have a healthy gut microbiome, which most people eating plant-based do. Isoflavones from soy may help with bone health. Fruits and vegetables are strongly associated with better bone health. Essential fatty acids are needed, and sufficient protein. Do you remember the days when we used to say protein causes bone loss? Don't eat, keep your protein as low as possible. Now we know actually we need to make sure we get sufficient protein. There are really two faces of protein. We had some things right, but not all things right back then. Protein does increase urinary calcium excretion, and it increases acid production, especially certain types of protein. Those have negative effects on bone health. The positive is protein promotes calcium absorption, and it enhances bone building activities. It maintains muscle mass and bone structure. And the net effect of protein tends to be somewhat favorable, except when you have inadequate calcium intakes and very high protein intakes, like a paleo diet. So paleo diet, no dairy, lots of meat. And so it could definitely work against them with the amount of protein they eat. Sufficient protein in plant-based diets is important for bone health, and we have a study, this is the Seventh-day Adventist Health Study 2, with over 33,000 participants, showing that people eating legumes at least once a day had 64% fewer hip fractures than those eating legumes less than once a week. And those eating meat analogs even, this is salty things, and we know salt increases calcium excretion, so this was a surprise to me. But even those eating meat analogs had 49% fewer hip fractures than those eating meat analogs less than once a week. You need to be aware also of bone robbers. So the factors reducing calcium absorption or bone building capacity are oxalates, phytates, excessive preformed vitamin A from supplements, excessive alcohol intake, and caffeine. Factors that enhance calcium excretion, too much salt, high metabolic acid load, and piles of protein, like people eating 150 grams or more a day especially. So I remember the advertisements in women's magazines back in the 80s by the dairy industry. There was one advertisement that said, oh, sure, plants have calcium, but it's not bioavailable. Only the calcium from cow's milk is bioavailable. And so that was how they were trying to sell their products. But is the calcium from plants bioavailable? Well, actually, we absorb about 32 to 34% of the calcium from dairy products. It's about the same for tofu that's made with calcium. But we actually absorb about 20 to 30% from things like sweet potatoes, legumes, and soy milk. And we absorb the most from low oxalate green vegetables like broccoli and kale and Chinese greens and turnip greens and mustard greens. We absorb the least from greens that are high in oxalates, like spinach and beet greens and Swiss chard. There's so much oxalates that the calcium is bound to the oxalate and it just goes right through. So we still get about 5%, maybe 10% of the calcium from these foods. So then some people say, well, what if I eat a salad that has spinach and kale? Will the spinach inhibit the absorption of calcium from the kale? And no, it doesn't. In fact, we still absorb some of the calcium from the spinach, but there's no problem with it negatively affecting the calcium absorption from the kale. So bone-wise choices in terms of diet, we want to meet our RDAs for calcium. We want to include some calcium and vitamin D fortified foods, and we want to design the diet to ensure optimal intakes of all of those bone-building nutrients. But perhaps most important is getting a lot of weight-bearing exercise. And maybe for people who are at risk, who are starting to have low bone density, to even consider wearing a weighted vest around the house to give you that extra weight-bearing. My recommendation would be 60 minutes of exercise 6 to 7 times a week. So daily exercise, an hour a day, every day. And finally, iodine. So people eating plant-based are definitely at higher risk for iodine deficiency. Why? Number one, we do tend to avoid iodized salt. And number two, we do not consume the common sources of iodine, which are fish and dairy products. So if you look at the iodine intakes and status of vegans, well, they have shortfalls. We have multiple studies showing vegans having lower than optimal intakes N status where iodine is concerned. But the risk is highest in places where they have low iodine content in their soil. And in North America, we have reasonable iodine content in the soil. But in Europe, we have some places like Italy and the UK and even Finland. A number of the countries in Europe really have very low levels of iodine in their soil. Iodine deficiency causes goiter if it's severe, which is an enlarged thyroid. And your thyroid enlarges to try to trap iodine. And it can cause cretinism, which is the #1 form of mental retardation in the world. It can cause stillbirth and miscarriage. So it's really, really important that women who are planning on getting pregnant, that they be iodine replete. Mild deficiency, even just mild deficiency, can rob your baby of 10 to 15 IQ points. And this can very significantly affect learning ability. So if you look at the RDAs, you're looking at about 150 micrograms for anyone over the age of 14 years, a little bit more during pregnancy and lactation. But look at this. For babies, birth to 12 months, you're looking at 110 micrograms for birth to 6 months and 130 for babies 7 to 12 months. That's a lot when you look at the relative weight of a baby versus an adult. It's almost as high as adult requirements. So it's a very important nutrient. So what are the sources? Well, iodized salt is a source. Seaweed and seafood are huge sources. Dairy is a source because iodine is used to clean cow teats. It's not that it's naturally there. It's there because we use it in cleaning the teats. Some grain products, iodine is a dough conditioner in those products. Some fruits and vegetables are reasonable sources as well, and eggs are a source. If you look at the iodine content of common foods, you can see seaweeds between 16 and almost 4,000 micrograms in a gram of seaweed. It's unbelievable. And then you've got cod, and then iodized salt, and then milk, yogurt, eggs, tuna. You know, this is all animal products. And then when you go down to look at the fruits and vegetables, you're looking at between about 3 and 12 or 13 micrograms in a serving. So they're fairly low amounts. And so it's really hard to get enough just from fruits and vegetables and even grains. So for 150 micrograms of iodine, we could use a supplement, whether it's a multi or a single nutrient iodine supplement. Iodized salt, you can get iodized sea salt without other additives, which you would want to read the label and make sure there's not these what do you call, to make the salt flow properly. There's sometimes additives that you really don't want, but you can read the label. And you don't want to be eating a lot of salt anyway, but you can get enough from about 2 mils, which is about a half a teaspoon. Will give you enough. And now seaweed is, to me, a healthier choice. It's got a lot of value. So you can get in about a 10th or a 16th of a teaspoon of kelp, of kelp powder, you'll get about 150 micrograms. That's just a tiny sprinkle. You don't even taste it in your soup or on your salad. That's a very reasonable way. Nori is the lowest in iodine of the seaweeds. You need about 1.5 sheets of nori to give you 150 micrograms. And then rame or dulse, you need a half a teaspoon. So it's, again, quite concentrated in iodine as well. So these are really good choices. The amounts in seaweeds vary so widely, and it's important to know that the upper limit is 1,100 micrograms. If you exceed that, you can end up with thyroid issues. And so we need to be careful of not overdoing the seaweed and just being really conscious, especially if you're using kelp. you can very easily consume toxic amounts. So if you're using kelp, it's very tiny amounts. What about the goitrogens in foods? Well, goitrogens are substances in food that can reduce the thyroid's iodine uptake and our production of thyroid hormones, but they're usually only a problem if someone has thyroid disease or iodine intake is insufficient. So let's say you're on a raw food diet and you're not eating seaweed, and you're eating a lot of cruciferous vegetables and a lot of goitrogens. It can actually contribute to your problems with making enough thyroid hormone. So what foods are goitrogenic? Well, cruciferous vegetables, flax seeds, peanuts, pine nuts, peaches, pears, strawberries, millet, soybeans, sweet potatoes, spinach, and green tea are all fairly reasonable sources of goitrogens. So should we avoid them? Absolutely not. Healthy people don't need to avoid these very nutritious foods, but we need to make sure we get enough iodine. Some people with thyroid disease may need to moderate their intake of goitrogens, and there are ways of doing that. So if you cook, like just steam lightly your goitrogenic vegetables, that will help to reduce the goitrogens. You can ferment the vegetables, that also reduces the goitrogens, and just increase the variety of foods that you eat. So don't focus on just millet as your grain, for example. Vary that so that you're not getting as much of the goitrogens. And then where thyroid function is concerned, we also need to be aware of getting enough selenium. And of course, the richest source in a plant-based diet is Brazil nuts. Vitamins A, D, iron, and zinc are also very important to thyroid function. And the other thing we need to know is if you have some problems with thyroid, you may have compromised ability to absorb vitamin B12. And so you need to be very conscious of your B12. The take-home message is well-designed, whole food, plant-based diets are nutritionally adequate and can provide very powerful protection against chronic diseases. And so finally, are there benefits to eating plant-based beyond ourselves? And the answer, of course, is absolutely positively yes. If you eat a plant-based diet, you're probably taking the most powerful step that any human being can take towards the preservation of this planet. And I want to tell you, when my son was in his fourth year undergraduate degree in environmental sciences, the professor had all of the students in the class calculate their carbon footprint. And my son lived about a half an hour drive from the university, or 20 minutes or something like that. And so he was driving a car, and there were a lot of students in the class that were super environmental keenists, and they were taking 2-minute showers and biking to school and all of those things. And when they calculated their carbon footprint, my son had by far the lowest carbon footprint in the class. And the other students were just, they were just outraged. They said, "But sir, he drives to school." My son called me right after this happened because he was so excited. The teacher looked at the class and said, "Read my lips. He doesn't eat meat. It doesn't matter how much he drives, you will never touch him." So I thought that was pretty cool of the teacher to say that. And the reality is the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences released a report in their journal in 2016 that actually did the math. And they said by 2050, greenhouse gas emissions would be reduced by 29% if everyone followed the global dietary guidelines to eat more fruits and vegetables and eat less meat, sugar, and calories. But they would be reduced by up to 70% if everyone went vegan. And their recommendation, a global shift to a plant-based diet. You know, Dr. Walter Willett will be here speaking, and he is, I believe, the most quoted epidemiologist in the world. And with, I think, 1,700 peer-reviewed published journal articles to his name. And he was heading up this Lancet Commission. And what he said was, transformation to healthy diets by 2050 will require substantial dietary shift. Global consumption of fruits, vegetables, nuts, and legumes will have to double. And consumption of foods such as red meat and sugar will have to be reduced by more than 50%, basically to achieve our goals. And plant-based diets, when we think about benefits beyond ourselves, we cannot ignore the benefits to our fellow creatures that we share this planet with. Eating plant-based, to me, is the most ethically justifiable choice. I can remember, I'm going to tell another story about my son. When my son was 3 years old, we were driving by a McDonald's, and he looked at me and he said, "Mommy, can we have a McDonald's hamburger?" And I knew he had seen the commercials of the hamburglar stealing the burgers off the trees. And I thought it was time to tell him that hamburgers don't grow on trees. So I said to him, I said, "Honey," I said, I have to tell you something. I said, the hamburgers at McDonald's are not the same as the hamburgers at home. At home, we make our hamburgers with beans and with nuts and things like that. And the hamburgers at McDonald's are made of cows. And he looked at me like I had just lost my mind. And he said, "Mommy, people do not eat cows." And I was trying to think of what to say, and then he said, "Do they, Mommy? Do they?" And I said, "Yes, they do." I could see the little tears coming down, and he said, "But Mommy," he said, "them have eyes." He said, "Don't they know that cows are people too?" And out of the mouths of babes, I thought, it's amazing how kids just get it. You know, when we think about ethical justifiability, if everyone ate plant-based, the global calorie supply would increase 50%, which could effectively wipe out hunger. And of course, the situation for animals, I love this little eat more kale, I became vegan because I decided to educate myself about animal agriculture when I had an interaction with a hunter who just happened to be one of our closest friends, and he was on his way deer hunting. And he said to me, I said to him, I don't understand why how you could feel good about going into the bush and shooting another beautiful deer. And I said, "What is it? It's not a sport. Why do you have to do this?" And it was what he said back to me that changed the course of my life. He said, "You know, Brenda, just because you don't have the guts to pull the trigger does not mean you are not responsible for the trigger being pulled. Every time you buy your piece of meat camouflaged in cellophane in the grocery store," he said, "at least the animals I eat have had a life. Can you say the same for the ones that are sitting on your plate?" And I was silenced because I had no reasonable response. And I vowed that I was a public health nutritionist, and I vowed at that point that I would find out more and take responsibility for the food I was eating. And when I started to research it, it took me about a week to say, I'm not doing this anymore. And I said to my Northern Ontario husband, who was best friends with the deer hunter, I said, we had never really met real live vegetarians. We were in Northern Ontario. It's beer, bingo, hunting, and fishing, basically, there. And I said, would you be willing to become a vegetarian? And he looked at me, and he smiled, and he said, I thought you'd never ask. He said, I would love to be a vegetarian. And I thought, How did I get so lucky? I picked very, very well. This year will be our 42nd anniversary. So I think I did okay. You know, the reality is 70 billion animals are slaughtered for food every year, and the vast majority are raised in CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations. Probably at least 90% in North America are raised in CAFOs. And we don't have time to go into detail, but I'll tell you just this, is that what we do to pigs, if we did to dogs, we would be charged with a criminal offense. It is beyond belief how we raise these sentient beings. And, you know, for me, the thing that comes to mind is, why would we as human beings cause pain, suffering, and death in our fellow creatures when it is not only unnecessary, but it is ultimately destroying our planet and destroying our own health? It makes no sense. Albert Einstein once said, we have to do the best we can. This is our sacred human responsibility. By getting our nutrition from plants, we all win. And we have a choice. When we consider the consequences of our food choices, not just for ourselves, but beyond ourselves, a plant-based diet, in my view, becomes both an ecological and an ethical imperative. And with that, these are my books, and with that, I'll say thank you very much for your attention.